Thank you and good afternoon. So in this intervention I would like to present to you briefly an ESPON policy brief that was developed at the initiative of the Bulgarian presidency and that again synthesizes the key results and policy advice coming out of our most recent studies, and that present the main governance, planning and financial tools that national, regional and local governments can deploy in order to support polycentric development in their countries. And to start with, I would like to firstly highlight why it is important to promote polycentricity through cooperation. So ESPON argues in favor of what is called a relational polycentricity. Also, from my experience, I know that sometimes polycentricity as a concept is associated with an approach that gives privileges to certain areas, more attention, more financing, more benefits. But this is not what polycentricity is about. Polycentricity in principle is about the need to increase cooperation among places, and this is justified by increasing interdependencies between actors and institutions. This is the environment that we are currently living in, and therefore promoting polycentricity, it cannot be possible without proper methods and approaches that promote cooperation. And we know, and all our ESPON's research has confirmed this one message, that nowadays there's no single governmental level that can fully address the contemporary development challenges, and that's why there is a need to develop a new culture of public policy and public action that promotes cooperation among places, that allows to join resources to increase the development potentials and the critical mass for development by engaging in joint cooperation activities, by understanding your development perspectives from a wider territorial context. And that's why it is important, again, to invest in capacity building and to enhance the capacities of cities and regions to network in multiple shapes. And accordingly, this also means rethinking the tools, the governance tools, the planning tools, and the financial tools that are at the disposal and can be made at the disposal of cities and regions in order to promote this relational and collaborative polycentricity. So here we present on this slide the main tools, and I will run you through them quickly. You can read more about them in the policy brief, and we also have another thicker document that we call a working paper that details all this information even further. What is common to all these tools are two key principles. They have to be designed for functional geographical scales, also because, as I mentioned, there is no one single government level that currently address the development challenges. This also relates to the main message that I presented in the first plenary, that nowadays developments are not bound by administrative borders, and when we say place-based, we mean functional urban, we mean by places we mean functional urban, we mean cross-border, we mean transnational places. And at the same time, another principle that is very important for these tools is to really promote networking and cooperation among places, because it simply helps to strengthen the development potentials and development perspectives and resources that can be devoted to growing places around Europe. Now, to start with the set of the governance tools, our latest ESPON research has developed policy advice on developing the so-called hard governance tools and soft governance tools. Hard governance tools are more institutionalized, more formalized, in many instances also top-down, have a top-down nature, so basically they are initiated by the national government, whereas soft governance has a more bottom-up nature, and also the scales of collaborations and the boundaries are not that well defined. They are often fuzzy, and also the institutional structures are not necessarily formalized, but at the same time important initiatives are also implemented within those cooperation areas. And what our research results suggest is that basically either hard or soft governance approaches can equally contribute to support polycentric development, and that once the culture of cooperation has become embedded in the way territories and stakeholders interact with each other and perform, it doesn't matter anymore actually whether the governance structure is legally formalized or not. Moving on to planning tools. Here we analyze three kinds of planning tools: strategic planning tools, statutory planning tools, and smart specialization strategies. If we look at strategic planning tools, then they are most often used as a tool to design a perspective for a place, to be supported also by EU funds, using the integrated tools that cohesion policy offers. And we see that tools like ITIs has also triggered quite a lot of strategic planning at functional geographical scales, and gave an opportunity in the current programming period to support joint investments within functional scales. We have many good practice examples, for example, in Central Europe, and hopefully we will hear about them also during this panel discussion. And this is also one of the reasons why we, of course, support the continuation of those integrated tools in the framework of cohesion policy, because they also usefully trigger the strategic planning at the functional scales. And we have, of course, useful examples from which we can learn, but I have to say that still this practice is not too overwhelming, so to say. Is not present everywhere in Europe. And what is another important challenge is that this planning at the functional scales is not fully embedded in the traditional planning practices, in the traditional planning systems. It is more or less a standalone practice, a standalone experience. And what is our advice, and accordingly the advice of our researchers, of course, is that there should be closer links, and this functional planning approach should find its place within the overall architecture of the planning system in the countries. And finally, if we come to financial tools, I also mentioned them in the first session. Well, here we see that they should be designed to support the implementation of local and regional strategies, and that are designed for functional areas, and make it possible to apply a multi-fund, a cross-sectoral, and a partnership approach that supports joint investment initiatives. And what we are very much looking forward to is really this discussion on how EU funds can be gathered around regional and local strategies and support their implementation using this multi-fund approach, and how far joint investments and cooperation projects among places could be eventually financed not only within Interreg as a territorial cooperation strand of cohesion policy, but also within mainstream programs. And this is for us also a very important direction of change to make cohesion policy stronger, speaking from a place-based perspective, to increase the returns on investment, to avoid wasteful overlapping investment, to avoid fragmented investment, and also, of course, to increase the visibility of investment at regional and local scales. And this brings me to the last part of this policy brief, the policy recommendations. And we usually formulate these policy recommendations for different scales. So regional, local is one, national and EU level are the other two. And we usually try to differentiate them according to the different needs of these different governance levels within, of course, a multi-governance setting. So if we start with regional and local level, first what is important in order to deploy these tools is to start by understanding the territory's spatial dynamics, the socio-economic development patterns, flows between places that were mentioned, and I do agree that we are still limited in terms of the available data and methodologies to understand those flows, and I very much appreciate the initiative of Eurostat to develop data in that respect, and ESPON will also contribute in future years with supporting new methodologies to analyze, to study flows among areas. And also what is important is, of course, to understand the development perspectives of different places in a wider geographical context. And that is why also ESPON's pan-European research is so important, because it actually helps people and places to understand where do they stand in relation to the others, what is their positioning, and how they can in principle increase their development perspectives, working alone or jointly, and preferably jointly, of course. And in order to develop this practice of cooperation, we advise to build upon existing traditions of collaboration, and to start with existing traditions of collaboration, and the usual fields where collaboration normally develops in the first instance and in quite a natural ways, for example, transportation or waste management or environmental protection, and we believe that these are the useful starting points. Then we also advise to initiate this cooperation through bottom-up, small-scale cooperation practices with local actors, and then allow for this cooperation to evolve in the future, and also to address new development challenges and reach out to new development fields. What is also important, of course, is to create a favorable arena for dialogue of the involved stakeholders, because cooperation among places is not cooperation between authorities, public authorities. If it really has to be a true cooperation, it has to engage private players, it has to engage local associations, it has to really give the voice to the people. And this again brings me back to my introductory statement of today. At the same time, it is very important for the engaged stakeholders, for the engaged players, from the start and at the very start of the process, to understand the benefits and the reasons why they need to come together and address certain issues jointly. And this collaboration, of course, has to be favorable for all parties and create some win-win situations. I come back again to the issue of political commitment. Cooperation among places can be triggered at the bottom-up level, at a bottom scale, but without the engagement of political leaders, there is a big chance that there will be no continuity in this process, and it will bring lower results compared to when there is a strong political leadership. As I mentioned previously, it doesn't actually matter whether this cooperation is institutionalized or not, as long as it brings results and benefits to the involved players. But at the same time, of course, one piece of advice is to develop certain cooperation structures in the process, but they have to be flexible, and those structures have to be able to adjust to changing institutional factors and also circumstances. And finally, what is important at the local and regional scale, of course, is while developing a joint understanding of the need to cooperate and understanding the cooperation fields and possible actions to be taken, certainly to identify implementation tools, because if there are no implementation tools attached to any cooperation initiative, then it will end very quickly, because without the real practical results, the motivation of involved players to engage in this cooperation will distort very quickly. That I also know from my own experience. That's why it is very advisable to think of implementation tools early in the process. Then if we move on to the national level, our advice here, and I mentioned that also before, is to establish an overarching policy framework and guidance to enhance the involvement of regional and local authorities in cooperative governance and planning initiatives. So basically to give an opportunity in legislation and through financing to basically encourage those bottom-up initiatives for cooperation, and which give an opportunity also to support association, and also this should come together with the initiatives to decentralize certain competencies and functions to the regions. It was also mentioned before, it is important for the national government to serve as a neutral mediator of the process and facilitate, and maybe if necessary also trigger, local association and local collaboration with the framework conditions that should be created, and at the same time without interfering with the actual process of understanding the potential realities and the needs to collaborate. So this function of the national government as a neutral mediator is very important and can be important not only in triggering, in some cases, the cooperation, but also to sustaining it in the long term. On the financial incentives, here we have two pieces of advice. One is, of course, to allocate financial incentives to support networking and building linkages among municipalities. And then there's one more extreme policy advice, take it or not. We also advise to consider maybe providing funds to those collaborative, to any development initiative on a condition that regions and cities engage in cooperative planning and cooperative governance. But this is a more, as I said, maybe a stick type of approach rather than carrot. And finally, supporting learning and knowledge sharing. Yes, here there's also an important role to the national government to share good practices, experiences, and to help cities and regions to learn from each other's experiences. And finally, at EU level, we advise to propose a policy narrative on the advantages of polycentric development and the role of cooperation among places, also as a way to achieve more efficiency in the use of public resources, wider geographical impact, and more visibility of policy interventions. And also at European level, we propose to consider to define collaborative governance and planning as a precondition for receiving EU fund support. And we firmly believe that if we plan EU fund investments at the level of functional geographies, and if we support joint investment initiatives within mainstream programs, we can ensure better visibility, less fragmentation, less overlapping investment, and more results for the available financing. What is also important, and what ESPON has been also supporting, is a methodology that allows to assess the territorial impacts, both ex ante and ex post territorial impacts of ESIF investment, and this is also an important element of the overall process to understand both what is the potential impact of those investments and also what could be eventually the impact after the investments are made. Then at European level, we also advise to facilitate horizontal and vertical coordination of programs to make sure that they jointly bring us to one result that we would like to achieve, that there are no contradictions, overlaps, and that they actually help also people to design their integrated strategies without getting too confused about the different funding sources. We also advise at the European level to support further research efforts. As I mentioned before, it is indeed very important to understand what are the links, flows, cooperation patterns among places, to encourage them to think from this broader geographical perspective. And finally, also at European level, we believe and very much support the initiatives of the Commission also to strengthen the capacity building part of cohesion policy, to help cities and regions to learn from each other and from their good practices. This policy brief is available online, and I'm open to any questions and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if we can take a couple of questions. Yeah, please. Wait, do you have a microphone? Thank you.
A question about national authorities, and as you mentioned, to serve as a neutral mediator, yeah? Well, I think there are definitely civil servants who try to act like that. But next elections are coming, and national politicians are really willing to, well, avoid this question, and they want to increase their power in the regions. So how to, well, deal with that?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I don't know how to deal with national politicians and their willingness to interfere in certain issues. But in any case, what I have seen from my experience, from my practice, is that there is a very important role of the national level to both trigger and also to support these local associations and local cooperation to make sure that we are using the resources that we have, and we usually have scarce resources, and they do become even more limited in the most efficient way. But how to overcome the willingness to use any processes for the benefit of and achieving political goals, well, I don't know, I don't have a political experience.
We have another question here.
My question is about smart specialization. And I was just wondering, when you mentioned that the role of the EU levels facilitate horizontal and vertical coordination, one of the things that they're also doing is asking each region to develop smart specialization strategies. And these strategies really are about developing core competences and creative and what we call competitive advantage, which I think is one of the things that people haven't done, is looking at the spatial implications of what smart specialization might involve. And I was wondering, the problem we seem to have is two different communities. One is the spatial planners and one is the smart specialization people. And I was wondering how these two can become, are we seeing a possibility of linking them together?
You're not making my life easier. Well, in principle, we advocated for using this tool of smart specialization strategies, indeed, because it is per se a collaborative tool that helps to bring different places together and to ensure a critical mass of resources, of academic, economic, social, financial resources, and therefore, of course, naturally, it requires engaging different places in this collaboration, because especially if we look at the local level usually misses one or two of those important preconditions to build a smart specialization strategy, and that therefore it is important to look at smart specialization potential from a more regional perspective, and of course it requires broader geographical view, but at the same time, of course, it requires also a very clear understanding of the spatial patterns and development perspectives of the places, and spatial planning is exactly for that. That's why we do believe that those two planning processes have to be interlinked, and therefore I also mentioned in the presentation that it is indeed very important for any planning practice that is collaborative, that is functional, that goes beyond the traditional system, still to find a way within the normal, the usual planning system and planning architecture. And I think it can easily be done by defining it in the legislation. For example, in my country we have a separate law on national development planning system that identifies the main levels and the key types of documents and elements and their interaction, both vertically and horizontally. And I think that it is time for the countries to rethink their overall planning systems to better link spatial, strategic, and also smart specializations, because as far as I know, also in the framework of the new regulations, smart specialization will still have a very important role to promote the innovative potentials of places and to stimulate this thinking of the need to join resources for stimulating innovative solutions.